So, good evening, good morning. No, there's no one who's good morning. That's being too ambitious. Good evening, good afternoon. I think everybody. I'll cover the bases. Paul, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to start, or
Good with
where
you,
do we
Will.
go?
You've got a better
Okay,
voice.
perfect. Yeah, I've been told I have a face for radio, so I don't know what that meant, but I don't think it was a nice thing. Thank you everybody for making the time tonight to join us. I'm Will Russell. I'm a lawyer with Sport Law. I have a varied background, I think I would say, in law. A lot of work with not-for-profit in the last for 3 years. Um, Paul and maybe a couple others on the call would say they have spent far too much time with me on various sport initiatives. So half of my task is within governance and bylaws and just making things go. And so we've come together for a series of 3 sessions on governance, but also just how to do things the right way. And I think governance sometimes puts people to sleep, but it really is important because it's how we do things. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it, let Wendy in, um, and go from there. If at any point, you know, you have questions, comments, disagreements, clarifications, jokes, really just anything you'd like to add to the discourse, please do jump in. This is not intended to be a formal setting. We are not a large group, and really just try to have a conversation. And if it is, maybe don't be so specific as, Will, who's also on my board, is giant pain and he does this, this, and this. But if you are dealing with challenges or frustrations, I think sometimes in sport where we often sort of have to tackle our challenges and that they're our own. And in fact, many of the things that from the seat where I am, my vantage point, there are a lot of common challenges and struggles. So I think if we can have an open and sharing environment, that would be really, really helpful to sort of pool the collective and use our collective wisdom and experience to help address this beast that is governance. So without further ado, I will share my screen without disclosing anything too secret. Just maybe a thumbs up that you can see a slideshow. Perfect. So this is our first one. It's really sort of the setting stage, as it were, with the governance fundamentals. So maybe sort of basic for some, but I think it's always good to come back to the first principles, because there are very few things that are difficult if we are able to drill down to their purest essence, as it were. So I'm from Sport Law. For those that don't know, we are sort of a one-stop shop for all things sport. I'm on the legal side, and dabbling on some of the other pieces. And that's my role. I'm still trying to push that we're outhouse counsel. It's instead of in-house counsel for sport. Hasn't caught on. The marketing team does not like it, but we are trying to be that resource for sport for whatever issues they may be. So there is going to be some homework. I don't know if that was told to you in advance, and some skill testing questions along the way. So maybe it's a way just to sort of ease into things. I'll ask the question, why is it that you're here? And hopefully it's not that someone told you and you have to sit here for the next hour, 90 minutes. Why is it that you're here? Does anybody want to sort of volunteer? And it can be aspirational. It can be, I was told I had to be here. So, what is it why you're here? And maybe if you do unmute yourself, you can just identify your organization. Don't everybody talk at once. You can either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and jump in.
Okay, I can jump in. My name is José Malo. I work in sport, Paralympic sports since many, 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 many years. As some person is in this group, and I'm curious. And I want to continue to understand how we can manage things from Quebec and things from Canada, and how we can match that correctly for athletes.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Welcome. Anybody else?
Yeah,
Sally?
I'm Sally. I'm with Parasport New Brunswick as a multi-sport organization. Here to bring back to the board. Unfortunately, none of my board members were able to be here today, but they will be on the next two. So providing some insights on the PSO space when applicable, but also how to better leverage our board members and optimize their skill sets to support our strat plan and operations.
Perfect. Thanks for joining. And I'll sort of multi-sport, I think it's not unique to this, these disciplines, these sports that we're having on the call, but I think it is a significant feature, and it will definitely touch on that going forward because it is a governance wrinkle, as it were, when we have a multi-sport organization. So welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Will. So my name is Peter Leiser, the Executive Director of Bocce Canada, so I'm a staff person, but we want to be a leader in good governance and be cutting edge in terms of good governance. So I'm here to learn how I can help facilitate that in my role.
Perfect. Thank you and welcome. Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Newman, and I'm been around for a while in the sports system, and I see lots of faces that I haven't seen for a while. So hello, Jane, and everybody, and it's nice to see everyone. My responsibility with Wheelchair Rugby Canada is to chair the governance committee. So I think it's always important to, despite the fact that I've been around for a while, to get some refreshers and some tips and understand what's required in that role. So I'm here to learn as much as I can.
Perfect. Thank you and welcome. And I think this is definitely a lot to learn. And I think one of the interesting things is that in sport governance these days, the goalposts are definitely not fixed. And they are moving, I don't know if on a daily basis, but certainly on a monthly basis, there's always a new thing that we need to address. And it's always, was used in a press conference from the minister in December that, governance is evolutive, which is always a anxiety inducing term. So welcome. Who else? I'm just trying to get the hands. I think that was an old hand from Kathy. So thank you for everybody who spoke, and certainly I hope everybody contributes and has questions throughout the session. And I think we're jumping into things. One of the significant challenges right now, and tell me if this rings true for anybody on the call, is that a lot of the governance issues that we have, or some of the challenges that we have, is that we just don't have the right tools for the job. That we're working through and we're running into procedural challenges. We're running into, the mechanisms aren't there, the jurisdictions aren't there, and we just have an outdated means of going about our business, and we need to address it. I don't know if this is true for anybody in the call, but I think that is something that I've seen, is that best of intentions are sort of crashing to the rocks of, well, we have bylaws that were last updated before some people, were born, and that's a significant issue, and looking to have that change, and we want to make the change, but we can't start. So does anybody have experience of sort of they just don't have the right tools to govern effectively? Yes, no, maybe. No. There's always the unique challenge of our federal structure, where we have the provincial territorial divide with the federal, the federal umbrella, and how we work in those lines, which at times can be significant or sometimes not much. So I think that's what we're trying to do here, is make sure that we are armed with the right tools to go through and to be effective in our organizations. And this is, again, use this slide a lot, it seems like, but to talk about the jurisdictional divides and trying to navigate things that aren't clear. And we did an organization flow chart, which included funders for different sports, and that, they identified 9 different funders at the provincial, territorial, and national level with all different requirements. And it is a challenge, right? Like, I don't know. I've asked this question and had a poll. I won't do it a formal one here. Is, if we were to craft a sports structure, would we craft it in the way that we have right now if we could start fresh? And I think we do need to recognize that there are some structural challenges that we need to address to navigate in good governance and in sport. And maybe I'll pause here, and I will turn over the group here to ask a question. Given, I do recognize we have a range of roles, responsibilities that different people play in their different organizations on the call today. But from a governance perspective, is there anything that keeps you up at night? Are there any concerns? And I just want to make sure that we go throughout the ER evening together, that I make sure I'm talking, addressing those concerns. Is there anything that, from your perspective, when you're wearing your hat and on the board or advising the board, that is a challenge or is a struggle? Everybody sleeps like babies. See a comment, insurance. Is that securing insurance? I think it was Marnie.
Yeah, hi, it is Marnie. Just understanding all the different types and needs, and we have a lot of equipment, and there's all kinds of things that, yeah, I'm not sure that we have to explore and make sure we get it right.
Yeah. And insurance documents are notorious for being easy to read and short, with no exclusions or anything like it. And that's certainly true. I'd say from a governance perspective, we always say, what's our directors and officers liability coverage? What's the extent of it? And having a good, I would say that's a best practice when you're joining to make sure that's up to date and you have that coverage. Kathy, you have your hand up.
I think this is governance, but what I am always concerned about is succession planning. And I think it's a really difficult area to navigate and try to identify and recruit new people. And then further to that, bring them along so that they have a good understanding of what the challenges and issues are within an organization and how to navigate them when they get into the leadership role. So succession planning, I think, is an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes we rely on a good person will put their name forward. We'll have someone there. And I think there's a push increasingly that we are deliberate and strategic in using, and we'll go into this a little bit today, but more in the next two sessions about looking at a skills-based board. We have a matrix that we're identifying what the different core requirements are that we need to move forward. And that, yeah, we're really having a plan about going out and recruiting people, not just relying on someone to put their hand up without being asked. Thank you. Wendy?
Yeah, I think just all the requirements now that, as you sort of touched on early on, that seems to be ever changing every day, from whether it's from your policy and procedures to reporting requirements, to your employment agreements, legal requirements with CRA or other sort of governance issues. It seems to be a ever-changing landscape. So trying to keep on top of that and having the resources to ensure that the documents and different things that you have, your policies and procedures are up to date and doing what they're supposed to be doing for the organization. So typically that requires legal, which is always quite expensive. So it's just I find it very overwhelming, and unless you have that kind of skill set on your board, it's something that you have to outsource all the time. But it's also just knowing. Without knowing, you sometimes don't know what to ask for either.
Yeah, and that's entirely fair. And I think for those who would be involved at the national level, we certainly have had a lot of that reporting requirements and the shifting sands that are the obligations to Sport Canada with respect to reporting, with respect to OSIC and abuse-free sport. That's certainly something that we're, it's a struggle to navigate. And I think that's one of the hopes out of tonight, is that rather than do this how many times for the organizations represented, that we can provide sort of a cross-cutting best practices for everybody, so we can at least provide some piece that doesn't have the cost attached to it for this onboarding, for this education in the government. So that certainly is a challenge that we're trying to work through. I think there is, I don't want to even say professionalism, but the expectation on sport and the complexity and the procedural mechanisms that you need to go through have increased exponentially in the last number of years. And it is definitely a challenge. So thank you for that. Kathy?
I just wanted to make one more comment, and I guess it sort of builds a little bit on what Wendy was saying. But the other issue from my perspective is we all have to do the same stuff. Eh? We all have to create the same policies. We have to create the same systems, and it just seems like such an inefficient approach that everybody has to invest in, creating these policies from scratch kind of thing. And I don't know, it just strikes me as though, why don't we just create some templates and everybody can drop their name into them and go on from there, so to speak. Be more efficient, I think.
I'll provide a comment into support and a comment in against, if I'm allowed to argue against myself in response to that, Kathy. And maybe just as a resource for how many folks here have been on the NSO sharing portal for that the COC has? Has anybody seen that resource? I see some people saying yes, and maybe I'll drop it in the chat. And I should say, I will circulate these slides, so don't take feverish notes like you're back in university not paying attention. I will circulate the slide deck as well as that resource. So the COC sharing, the NSO Sharing Center is a good resource for some pieces. It's a lot. I think, Paul, it's probably, and Peter, it's probably fair to say it's a little more operational than governance, but there still are some good pieces there in terms of different challenges and different pieces that they've seen from a sector. And that was something we tried with the safe sport piece to try to have some templates. But no, I think looking to have, a standard approaches and templates, I think one of the pieces that we do always need to recognize is that we can do, templates are very effective for the same jurisdictional band, right? So we could put something out at the national level because we are bound by the same legislation, right? We're bound by the, with respect to our governing legislation as NSOs. And the same thing that we could do so within Alberta or Nova Scotia, Ontario, that we have comparable requirements from our respective government bodies. So I think we certainly can look at templates, but the caution is, let's just make sure that we are doing it within the right jurisdiction, because there are 3 provinces with their own privacy legislation, which have very differing requirements. So there are definitely elements that we can do where there are commonalities, but we always need to make sure that we're working within the right jurisdiction. And please change the name throughout. There's nothing worse than I get something and they have to bring it to a hearing and it has the wrong name in it. But no, Kathy, I definitely agree. And I think to, not repeat myself too much, but I think that's something we're trying to accomplish tonight, is have a common learning and a shared pool of resources to have these sessions. Everybody else sleeping like babies, no big governance concerns or headaches that, on the horizon for them.
I would hope that at some point we cover risk management. We have a risk registry, but I think it needs to be reviewed regularly.
Yeah, and that's gonna be one of the things that we certainly address, because I think it's more of a dynamic one in terms of the key pieces. But yeah, that's definitely part of it. And one of my colleagues, Jason, is one who does a lot of that. So thank you for your comments so far. Now, these are some of the common issues that we see. Conflict of interest, and sometimes it's conflict of interest. I always try to make sure, and we'll touch on this later on, that we remove the negative connotation that people declaring a conflict should be something that's supported and encouraged. So, but that's always a chance of people wearing 2 hats. Lack of trust between the jurisdictional levels or the decision makers. Sometimes we have massive boards. The committees are a little bit just log jammed and the terms are too long. We have people on the board because they've been around for a long time. They don't particularly have the skills, but Why are they there? And we don't have the people to fill the gaps to address the needs of the organization. That we don't have, focus or direction, that we're all over the place. And we don't have enough resources in terms of both people. I mean, I don't know, maybe some of the organizations have too many volunteers, but as a general rule right now, that pool of volunteers is shrinking, and sport needs a lot of people to function. To put on an event takes dozens, if not hundreds of people to do everything from delivering the jerseys to opening the doors to driving to setting up the facilities to tearing down. So these are a lot of the governance challenges that all go into the inability, that contribute to challenges for organizations to function effectively. And I think a lot of the times when we have this mistrust or just this challenge, a lot of it comes down to, we'll go into this in the session next month, is lack of clarity in the roles and expectations. And who's doing what, and what are you supposed to be? We can't be everything to everybody. We can't both deliver high performance programs and grassroots and set standards. Like, we need to say, as organizations at the national, the provincial, and the territorial level, and even at the community level, we need to know who's doing what and have a discussion about where there's inefficiencies. If we are each putting in, just because it is, I know many will be tired of hearing it, but I'll use the dreaded words, for safe sport. Is that a responsibility that every single organization, from community to club to PSO to PTSO to NSO, should have? Or what are we doing to share the burden? And what are people looking at us to do? So to have this clarity in this discussion, I think, is always an important thing, in that it's something that you revisit frequently. Oops, I went too far. And I think one of the challenges with governance is that very, very rarely, if ever, will someone come to you and say, "Oh my goodness, what a fantastically governed organization you are. I would like to give everybody a gold star on the board." Very, very rare to get that. You will get but the negative press, or the negativity around allegations of poor governance, can be very loud. So I think it's one of those things, is that commitment and good governance, to give away the ending, I think, is critical, and can set the tone for your organization on the operational side, but you're not always rewarded for it. And that could be a challenge. But certainly know that poor governance can be a very visible piece, and expose you to some criticism. So now getting into a bit of the nuts and bolts. I promised some quizzes, and we have another quiz. Now, without cheating, without Googling, who can tell me either your mission, vision, or value statement? Gold star to the first person who jumps on.
Building community through parasport. It's our vision.
Anybody else? No. No one? I'm not going to check, so you can just make something up.
Have a good understanding of the vision of the association or the organization.
So what I'll sometimes recommend as a best practice. Oh, Peter, did you want to? Oh, no. Is that at the start of your board meetings, you actually read out what it says in your bylaws is your mandate. What is the purpose? Why does your organization exist? For some organizations, they have a strict focus on grassroots development, delivering services at the community level. Some have a mix of high performance and community growth, or providing pathways for people in different sports and different disciplines. So I think I encourage as a best practice that it is a very grounding exercise at the start of your board meeting to say, this is why we are here. And a lot of the times when we get stuck into decisions and we're deliberating, it's often a really helpful exercise to take a step back and say, what is our North Star in this situation? What are we as an organization trying to do? And if you have, you do have a role to develop Paralympic or other, performance pathways, then that's part of your mandate. But if it's not, you have that opportunity to interrogate and to question why you're going down certain directions. So I think, it may seem a little bit silly, but I think it can be a really helpful reminder to say, this is our legally stated purpose for why we're here. Anybody else Google their mission or their vision? They want to jump in now? No? Okay. And I think, part of that and having those building blocks, it really is arming ourselves with the tools. And that you'll hear me say this a number of times today, but knowing what the tools in your toolbox are is a really essential piece. There's the mention of insurance and the policies, and those are certainly part of it. But understanding your bylaws, doing your homework in advance. I know this sounds very, very simple, but and maybe even a sense silly, but those fundamentals can go a long way. Showing up, having a full understanding of what the financials have been presented, having control on what the risks are, can really help to see what's on the horizon and to address it. So these are all sort of, there's no single magic bullet, as it were, when it comes to governance that we can say, do this and you're good, right? Like there's just nothing. A lot of it just comes down to time and preparation. I promise I will be more interesting and provide more feedback than that. But unfortunately, sometimes it does come down to that basic of an issue. And having these guidance, having those mission, vision, values, and having those at our forefront, because they are our driving purpose. They are the reason we exist. And having a clarity of purpose can be a really important piece, because if we are unsure about what we are trying to accomplish, it shouldn't be a surprise when we don't get there if we don't actually know where we're going. So a commitment to strategic plan, to reviewing it, and to assessing it. I think sometimes where we fall when we're going down this governance route is that we haven't actually set up our progress goals. We've set a destination and said we want to do X, but we don't have the measured steps along the way to get there. We want to be the best, which is that's a great thing to be. Best at what? How are we going to measure when we're actually the best? How are we going to get there? And all these things, to put in KPIs, to put in those progress goals, is a really essential part of this, so that we as boards, as directors, as senior leadership within the organization can say we're on the right path. Because we can't just start down a road to a destination without knowing what are the steps along the way that we need to deal with. If at any point someone thinks that what I've said is wrong or they want to clarify, I'd welcome the comments. These are some of the basics, but looking at that question of accountability, how do we make sure that we are communicating with folks, that we aren't just dealing with things and putting them out during our AGMs? What is our method of communication to our membership so they understand the challenges, so they understand the pieces that we're going through, that it's not just silence that we come out whenever there's issue. That there are, we do have, integrity, and that we are looking to have respectful and equitable opportunities for folks. I think it's important to note that nothing of what I suggested here is to say that boards should be conflict-free. I think a board where there is not a level of disagreement is a dysfunctional board. You need to have a board space where different ideas are tested, and through that process of respectful disagreement, you come up with the best result. Because if everybody's just saying yes, how do you know where there's actually a hidden threat? How do you actually test those ideas, test those concerns, see where the challenges might lie? So I really do think that I encourage that generative friction to say that you need to have room for disagreement with the ideas, hopefully not with each other, and that you're able to sort out, to press through, and to come up with a solution at the end of the day that is better for the debate and the discussion. Hierarchy of documents. This is really important that we understand that in our governance that we, at the very top, we have whatever our governing legislation is, be it a Societies Act at the provincial territorial level, the national level, that, everything we do has to align with the Act. For those based in Ontario, you've had about 10 years warning about UNCA. It's now coming as a surprise that the deadline's coming up. But, we have those legislation, and we do always need to make sure that we are aligned with it, and that we are staying on top of it. Touch on this in a minute, and this is certainly a challenging space. But then for the NSO level, we of course now have the Canadian Sport Governance Code, which as of April 2025, it was addressed in December that it would be a mandatory piece for NSOs. That remains very much a piece in flux in terms of they issued review. Those many should have received a survey about some of the governance challenge 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago, the start of the year. And it remains to be seen, but it is sort of occupying a superior rank on our hierarchy of governing documents. So we have legislation. Slightly below it, we have the code, we have our bylaws, we have our regulations, and we have our policies. And to understand that anything that we do at that lower tier has to align with everything above it. You can't have a policy that contradicts your regulations, if you have one, that contradicts your bylaws, that contradicts the legislation. So you always need to make sure that everything filters down. I think when we are looking at what it means to be a member or participant in our organization, that we both look to define in our policies, particularly around the safe sport, the participation piece, but then we also look at it in our bylaws. And I think a lot of sports are looking to say, what does it mean to be a member or participant, and how do we address it? And it starts with your bylaws. It starts with defining that. Canada Sport Governance Code, I think, just to put here that there are, I think, some tensions about misalignment with the Act or the different pieces of legislation. There are a lot of very, very, very strong elements within the code, but there are some pieces that do introduce a level of tension that we are still trying to sort out as a sector. And I think that it's going to be an evaluative document as we go forward to make sure that we are actually having the best practices. But there are a number of elements in there that I think I strongly encourage, even if you are at the provincial or the territorial level, that you look to align with, even if it's not mandatory. The discussion about nominations committees, term limits, the independence of directors we'll touch on a little bit more, gender balance on the board. There are a lot of strong elements within the code that I do think that we should look at, even if it's not a mandatory piece. Has anybody read the code? Is there anybody in the call who's not familiar with the code? Kathy?
I have read it and I'm familiar with it. I guess my one question is, I know that they were talking about shifting it to the fall to be implemented. Is that still the case, or
Updated in the fall.
updated?
I think we can my, albeit somewhat battered and bruised crystal ball would say probably locked September, October for when we would get updates, which will, of course, we'll then have to address, well, are we calling SGMs or AGMs if it's going to be a hard requirement that we adopt by April? My understanding is that, you know, they're going to be looking at how they can work with the sector to bring this forward. But I think we'll be looking at updates sometime in the early fall.
Okay.
But it's like most things in sport, flexible deadline. Paul or Peter, sorry.
No problem. I can say Paul. I get that.
Yeah.
Well, a couple things. My interpretation is that you will have to have a plan in place on how you're going to adopt the Canadian Sport Governance Code by the fall. That's what I understand.
Okay.
But that being said, just because I have 3 board members on this call, I just want to answer your question. We have reviewed the Canadian Sport Governance Code. We did it last fall. We're waiting for the new version to come out. Some of us completed surveys on that. So from our board perspective and the 3 board members that are on here, we did an initial review of it, and now it's how we're going to comply with it once the new version comes out. So.
Yeah. I think the challenge is that the code wasn't necessarily developed as a mandatory piece. It was developed as a lot of best practices. Here's what we think would be, you know, best practice would be a leading piece for element for national sports to adopt. And so there's a lot of gray areas that can be a challenge to have strict compliance. So I think many sports are moved towards and have done an evaluation. I think there's going to be some much needed clarity provided in the next coming months about that piece. We hope. So organizational roles, you know, starting at the top, we have the board, we have our officers, executive within that, we have our staff, volunteers, members, and including that is, you know, athletes and coaches and everything like that. Next slide, we'll touch on this, but recognizing that people in many organizations will wear different hats and clarifying how we communicate and how information is shared is a really important piece. And inevitably, when there is a level of conflict and we're brought in, or a lot of it does have to do with how information is shared and how we are discussing and how we are communicating. And are there unofficial and official challenges? Is it based on past relationships? And it can be a really easily overlooked piece is that what are the different roles within the organization, how we are communicating with them? And do we ensure that we are maintaining and clarifying those relationships when someone comes on? So knowing those organizational roles, having a clear definition, having a flow chart, knowing who's going to be doing where is a really important piece. And on that, like, you know, what is the reporting structure? If as a board member, you have a question that you would like to have answered, how do you get that answer? Do you reach out directly to staff? Do you go through your board, or do you go through your CEO, your executive director? I will recognize that there is never a perfect solution. We have organizations of a range of sizes, a range of capacities. Some have multiple staff, some may have no staff, some may have one staff. And that, you know, we do recognize that. But I think having clarity is a really important piece. You know, I will speak for the staff on this call to say they probably don't have enough hours in the day to do what they need to do. And a lot of if there is anybody, you can volunteer to say I have nothing to do. But you know, on that piece, making sure we have an efficient flow of information so that when questions are asked, that we know who they're going to, that we're not just, hey, quick question. That quick question for someone may take them an hour out of their day to deal with. So having the appropriate reporting mechanism, we know who we're going to be speaking, is really, really important. And it also minimizes the opportunities or the risks that there may be miscommunications or a lack of clarity. Oh, I heard that, or I heard this. And it's not to say that we have to sort of be robotic in our communications, but we are deliberate in how we are speaking, how we are asking the questions of people within our organization. And also, not to be neglected in this reporting, is that we are including our membership, our participants in our communications. Because I think sometimes there's a question of, I actually don't know what the NSO is doing or what the provincial or territorial organization is doing, that there's a lack of understanding, that we all sort of work in the dark until we ask for fees or we come up with a policy that someone has to sign up for. So looking at that and having some clarity in that reporting and how we communicate is a really important piece of governance. And often when that's neglected, that, we don't want to just be providing a single notice in the form of here's our AGM, here's our package once a year. So looking at this, always at the end of the day, the organization is for the members. However they are defined as institutions or organizations or individuals, that it is the members at the end of the day that the organization works for, is created for, has a legal obligation to. So, the members have control of the organization by who they put in charge on the board, who they elect the auditors, and by determining what are the rules, the governing documents, the bylaws that are going to be followed as the board goes about their executing between AGM and AGM. So I think it's a really important piece that our members, however defined, know that is their voice is defined in the bylaws. And if we ever have challenges, that we encourage folks to go to the bylaws and say, here are your rights that you can do. The board, of course, is entrusted with the organization to act in the best interest of the members. That it's not that those are the individuals that they are accountable or responsible to. And then our incredibly valuable staff are the ones who are at the direction of the at the overall strategic direction of the board, are actually putting their vision into operation and executing on it, and being those individuals who deal with the day-to-day. So I think we've sort of touched on a number of the elements of governance as just very, very building block. And now we're going to go into a bit more of the good governance piece. I'll just pause here, if nothing else, to give my voice a little bit of a break and say, is there any quick questions from anybody on the call so far? Or jokes? Both are welcome. Paul, I hope it's a joke.
Yeah, it's not a joke, unfortunately. Just wondering, well, if you speak to the Canadian Governance Code and the importance of alignment. We've got provinces on the call, we've got nationals, but we've got these requirements of a national organisation. And as you kind of said, the model is that our members kind of have to vote upon that. But just where are maybe some of the risks with the adoption of the Canadian Governance Code, or some things that we need to be doing to ensure we have alignment with what we're trying to do with the Canadian Governance Code?
Yeah, thank you for that, Paul. I think the key challenges is the definition of independence, right? About what it means and how it works. That there's a 40% threshold about independence. Within the code, we do recommend that you try to move more towards 100%, but it can be a piece where it can be a departure from how we've operated in the past with respect to organizations or members who sit on the provincial territorial sport bodies are elevated to the national to serve at the same time. And those wearing of the two hats has been a piece has been quite a challenge for folks to navigate and declare it. But that is something we have to do as NSOs, where the code is mandatory light or mandatory, as it were, right now. That can be a challenge. Does that address it, Paul? Were there are a number of other pieces of that, but I think that's one of the biggest ones that I've come across.
Yeah, I think one of the pieces, kind of speaking with NSOs, that our members have to vote on these changes, and so it's kind of important that our members understand the changes, because not voting on them or not being able to vote on those bylaw changes has impact on the national sport organisation. So there's some work to do to ensure that our members are aware of not just what we're trying to do, make these changes to bylaws, but why the changes are important and what impact it has on recruitment and other pieces.
Yeah, and funding, can be a key issue. And I think understanding the code, understanding the restrictions that it does place on organizations is important. That this isn't often the idea of staff to bring forward these, at some points, quite comprehensive edits and revisions to the bylaws, but they are very important to put forward. And the code is good. Just there are of course some areas of gray that we could use to clarification, but the code does have some really positive elements to it. But it is important that we do recognize that you show up at the SGMs. Okay? Like, we can't get them ahead if we don't have the votes. So and to understand that we are doing it not just for fun. Type of board, and I will say before we even get into this discussion that there is, I don't know if I've come across an organization yet where they fall squarely into one or the other. There is of course all manner of organizations who have different roles and responsibilities. I think if, to the extent that we do have boards, and there's certainly, I expect some that in this call it would be more operational, that whatever we're doing is deliberate, that we have a really clear understanding of what we are trying to do, and we're not just doing it just because. And that it can be a challenge to navigate both the operational elements that are required from the day to day with your overall strategic piece. And that's one of the challenges that we try to at least have and identify, and to the extent possible, limit the operational elements where possible. Is there anybody who has experiences with the governance or the more operational board? I will say that most have some form of a hybrid setup. Is there anybody here that's purely operational? Anybody here that's purely governance or strategic board? Yes, no, maybe so.
I'd suggest we Boccia leans more towards the governance, but it's not 100% crystal clear. Occasionally we seep back into operational.
Yeah. And I think whatever you do, that we are deliberate in it, right? Like, that we are going to be playing both those roles, but that it's not something that just happens, that we're very calculated in the operational pieces that we do. Kathy?
So I'm also the president of Wheelchair Basketball Canada, and I feel that our board operates more on the governance side of things. So very strategic in what we're trying to accomplish. And I'd say we don't sort of stick our oar into the operational side of things. So probably way more governance.
Which I think is the trend, and I think is really important, because I can't recall who sort of made mention of it earlier, but there are so many things to keep track of at the board level. To mix the governance and the strategic with the operational can be such a challenge to keep track of everything. So I think someone mentioned, that they're, to look earlier on, we were looking at, what is good governance, how we can follow good governance. And I think one of the pieces is everybody has governance. Kathy, I can't tell if that's a new or an old hand. Jump in if you want. Oh, hold hand. Everybody has governance, right? We all have our structures and our mechanisms. But when we are moving towards a good governance, is that, we're always pushing and always having that inquisition of, do we have the right structures? Do we have the right process? Are we getting the right people? Are we getting the right funding? Are we following our strategic plan? Where are the gaps? And there are times when we say, like, we keep running into this issue over and over and over again. And at some point I have to say, like, what is that challenge? Is it a province to province divide? Is it the fact that we don't have an organization within respective jurisdiction to manage the discipline, to manage the sports? What are the pieces that we're running into where we have this structure, but we need this? And to question, to say, it may be that you say we do have the right mechanisms, we do have the right structures in place, but there may be occasions where you don't, and you really need to have that assessment. And it can't just be, we have, it's functioning, right? I know we're all strapped for time and attention, but we always do need to say, like, is there a way to shift? And some folks on the call may have already heard this, but we don't. There's a quote that I like to use a fair bit. It's like, we don't rise level of our ambitions, we fall to level our process. And for governance, I think it really does. If we have an antiquated system that is clunky, that doesn't fit with the needs of sport in 2024, we're going to run into challenges. So I think I would urge everybody, is, if nothing else, when you go to say, leave today and say, what is the process we have, and is there any way to make it better? And usually, if you run into something and you have it a challenge 3 times, it's probably something you need to do. Another good place is of good governance, I would say, is knowing where you're going, that you have a plan, that you know what your destination is, and that you have the resources. I can't sit here and say that sport is not a costly endeavor at times, and that we need to make sure we have the people and the capital and the equipment in good repair to make sure that we are able to get where we want to go. If we are looking to grow membership, what do we need to do so? Do we have the equipment to accommodate a growing membership? How are we able to address it? So setting out those progress goals, seems a lot of my advice is based these days, or the sound bites are come from what I will tell to my kids. But how do you eat a whale? One bite at a time, right? So that when we say we want to be the best, we want to be a model of progressive, positive, healthy, welcoming sport that is in every community, that we're able to say that is great. How do we tease it out? How do we pull out, what are the steps along the way that we're going to need to get there? What are the resources that we're going to need? If it is a policy review or a strategic plan or buying equipment, and how do we monitor? We can't just say start, finish. So what are the steps along the way that we're able to monitor and say, we've missed here, we've exceeded our target here, and we need to address these other pieces? And what is the accountability? Of course, there's always going to be accountability to our funders, but what is the accountability to our members? What is the accountability to our participants, to our athletes, to our coaches? To know that we are moving forward and we are making progress, and we're not just sort of having a stated goal, but not actually telling people where we are in the path to achieving that vision. When things go sideways, and sometimes in sport things do go sideways from a governance perspective, it's quite rare in my experience that it happens completely out of the blue. And I 100% stole this quote from Hemingway, so this is not my quote. But a lot of the times is that there are a steady drip along the way, that there are issues that come up that aren't addressed, that they're not identifying risks, that there's not control, that there's agitation or conflict beyond the healthy amount at the board level, and then it erupts into a crisis. It's quite rare for there not to be the signs along the way. So when we're looking at, governance gone wrong and some of the challenges, I think what you'll often see is, often confidence, and it can spill over into a whole host of other issues that we'll see. You can have very rarely the very sudden piece, sudden crisis, but it's often that gradual erosion that you have long simmering tension between jurisdictions that slows things down, that there's not trust, that there's a feeling of there's no transparency. We only hear from you once a year when it's we get our notice that our AGM is coming up in 21 or 30 days. So there are a lot of these pieces that come up that I think having a strategy, having good governance practices can address both the acute and the chronic governance gone wrong issues. I think touch on this again, but to understand that the board is a singular entity, that it is a unified piece, that we want to have that generative friction, that we want to have that lively discussion at the boardroom table, but that at the end of the day you speak with one voice, that when a motion is passed, that's passed and that's it, that we don't continue the debate outside of it, because that can have a really corrosive effect on the operations, on the trust in the organization. That we really look to have a strategic piece, and that the board has clarity through its policies, its guidelines, its regulations that it puts into place, and that when we look to have committees, and oftentimes committees is where a lot of the heavy lifting can be done within the organization in terms of hammering out the details of policy, not something you want to be doing around the boardroom table, that you do have partnerships and you do have alignment from staff who can often identify some of the key challenges and speak to the lived experience. I'm going to pause there and just see if there's any questions, or if anybody needs coffee or tea or something at this late hour. I don't know if anybody else is on the East Coast, but I am, so I'm probably later than most. Peter? I'll mute.
Yep, no problem. First time. I have a couple questions, but I'm going to hold the one for later because I don't want to monopolize the questions. But did you say when Paul was asking about the Canadian Sport Governance Code, and in the governance code says 40% of your directors should be independent, and I thought I heard you say something about 100% in terms of you have a feeling that it should be about 100% of the board should be independent, or am I putting any words in your mouth?
Nope. I think where you can move to have more independence, and just that definition of independence is that you are not that you do not sit on a board of a provincial or territorial organization.
Okay.
So
that's
that the definition of independence is quite narrow. It's not that you're engaged or otherwise involved. Really, from a strict legal sense, is that you don't owe a fiduciary obligation to a different organization within the same discipline.
Yeah. So I understand that, because if it was, I'd have to look at the definition of independent, but you're right. If it was purely independent, you would never have an athlete on the board. You would never have an official maybe represented on the board. You would never have a PSO represented on the board if it were 100% independent.
I'll just challenge you a little bit on the choice of words there.
Yeah.
Because you said representative.
Oh, did I? Okay.
And I think that's something that, but that's what we're looking to do, is that you can absolutely have every single head of every provincial and territorial organization sit on your board, or attend your board meetings, but are they a director?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the pieces that we're looking to navigate, is that we're not trying to silence anybody's voice. And I skipped ahead because it's not a Stephen King novel. I can give away the parts at the end, but you know, and I think from an athlete perspective, that's another piece. The board, the governance code does not mandate that a athlete, and I know there's some things, but that the requirement is that we have substantial representation within the organization. So what are the different mechanisms that we can do where they don't necessarily put themselves in almost a de facto conflict of interest, particularly if they're a current athlete? Because there's going to be very few decisions that the board makes other than the colors of the jerseys, but the board shouldn't be making that decision anyways, where it's not going to have an impact on the athlete. And I think that's one of the big flags that many sports have said, hold on a second, aren't we in, you know, we're on this side, we're saying let's be independent, but on this side, we're saying we're introducing an issue of a conflict of interest. So just to skip ahead, this is the definition of independence is really limited to, do I owe a fiduciary obligation to someone else within that national or provincial structure for that sport?
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on this, Will, just a little bit more.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes people don't fully understand what fiduciary means, which I think you're the lawyer here, but I think it really means you have to look out for the best interest of the organization, the corporation. That's what fiduciary is, the best interest. I think some people tend to think it's a financial thing when it's not a financial thing at all. And here's my part two of the question, Will.
Yeah.
Is oftentimes committees are struck. The board can strike whatever committees that they want. And oftentimes committees are struck from the board. And oftentimes the board are chairing those committees. And they may be governance-based committees like finance and audit or HR and compensation and that, right? But if they were more operational, like a development committee, how you're going to grow bocce, wheelchair basketball, wheelchair rugby, if they're more development, do you see that maybe that would be difficult for that person who may be chairing that committee, who's also sitting on the board, because it might cause kind of some board holism issues, or because again, really their duty, their fiduciary duty goes back to the board of directors versus perhaps what maybe an operational committee might come out with. So I'm just wondering, do you see how someone might be in kind of a twisted conflict there by sitting on both? Did I properly explain that? Maybe I didn't.
Yeah, I'm just really trying to avoid the cliche lawyer answer of it depends. So I'm not going to say it depends, and I'll just say this. Committees only have the authority and the jurisdiction that a board grants them. A committee cannot do anything that a board does not authorize it to do. And I think we need to be clear on what the terms of reference for that committee are. And there's a very good reason to have board members chair or sit on committees. They can then tell the board very quickly what that committee is doing and what's going on. They have the oversight. I wouldn't frame it as a conflict of interest per se, just because the committee can't do anything that contradicts the board. I hope not. And if we do, we think we need to have a conversation about that, because their authority is derived and spun out of the board, right? They can sort of, the board can snap their fingers and the committee disappears. So, but I do think it puts it in a practical conflict of, if there's an operational piece and the committee is doing something and the board doesn't necessarily agree with it, then there can definitely be a tension introduced for that board member who's sort of saying, hold on a second, I've put forward this, I understand this, and the board is saying, no, you have to drop your budget by 50%. Is that maybe sort of touch on some of the challenges? And I think sometimes one of the better things is say, maybe you don't have the chair of the committees, particularly the larger ones, be a member of the board, that you have a representative on the board who can report back, but maybe the person who is chairing it isn't going to be that board member, to reduce that thing. So you have the guidance and the perspective of the board member, but maybe they're not the ones who are sitting, making those and leading those pieces, and knowing just how committees work, oftentimes being that one who does the work between meetings. Does that help?
That's very helpful. Thank you, Will.
So, some of the governance challenges, I think this can be summed up on, knowing who your people are or your organizations. And it seems really simple, but sometimes that's a challenge, right? And we've experienced that with, trying to register people in Safe Sport. And it was, there was some very interesting stuff around COVID when we had COVID attestation, because a lot of people are recognizing, why do we have 40% more participants in our activities than we thought before? Because we didn't know who our people were. So, looking at having clarity in your bylaws of who your people are is a really important piece. And knowing what is the connection between your people at the national level. Do you have any relationships with anybody? Do they fall under your umbrella other than your national team? Do you have people at the community, provincial, territorial level who fall into the national umbrella, or are your people, your board, your staff, and your national team? What is that, vertical integration, as it were, down to know who your people are? And then what are you asking of each of them? Your members, your participants, your registrants, whatever term you're using. What are you asking of them? Do you have clarity on that, both in your bylaws and in your policies? And the good thing is, once you have that as part of strategic plan, these aren't pieces that you have to move around very often. But it really is an important and often overlooked piece, is that, sport safety, safe sport is a governance imperative. And it starts with, do we understand who our people are? This is also a challenge that, sometimes governance is viewed as a nice to have, not a must have or a need to have, and that we're selective in when we pick and choose when we're going to follow the rules. And, there are places where we can be flexible. What Robert's rules does allow for motions to be passed by unanimous consent, so you don't have to have everything be very structured. But I think it protects everybody to have a certain level of rules and alignment on the governance and our practices, even for our meetings, that minutes are not the most enjoyable documents to write, but they are really important. Because if we can't provide a record of how we've made a decision, that's a challenge, especially if we have someone ever questions what we do, or we're just trying to say, what did we decide 8 months ago? In Olympics and national championships and all these different things in the past. So they really are, in the moment, they may just say, oh yeah, we'll remember that. But 8 months, 12 months from now, 2 years from now, it can be a challenge. So the extent that you can establish a baseline for communication, for what you're going to be doing as your minutes, for where you're storing them, that process can go a really long way to deal with challenges and prevent challenges in the future. We've touched on this about what kind of board you want to be, but being deliberate, knowing the relationships, understanding the communications, where you want, when you have that first board meeting after your AGM, what are we trying to accomplish this year? We are holding a world championships in Canada this year. That is going to dominate the board's direction. So you're probably going to have a shift to operational because of the realities of what you're doing that year. So you can be fluid, you can have some flexibility, but do be deliberate in it so that you're not deciding in the moment. Draw those lines early, determine the communications early, determine the structures you're going to need, the committees you're going to have to strike early, and follow through on them. Because the last thing we want to do is dabble. Right? That's, I think, a very dangerous thing. Where we start dabbling is a very dangerous area to be. So, board of directors, we've touched on this. looking at the strategic direction, that mission statement, what are you doing as an organization, for whom and where, looking at your strategic plan, either developing it or ensuring that you're on track with it, and making sure that you are using it as your North Star, that you are not straying from it, and that you're able to make sure that, and if your mission statement's hard to keep to, maybe it's because it's not properly defined. Maybe you need to understand that actually we say we're this, but are there elements that we can drop or add? Looking at the policies, ensuring that, you're not paying the internet bill, but that you do make sure that there are controls, that you don't have 7 internet bills for everybody in the office at their house, right? So that you are having there's a risk registry, which we'll touch on further in the future sessions, that you do have those mechanisms in place to not stymie the work of staff, but make sure that you have an appropriate checks and balances. And of course, that you're approving and you're monitoring the budget, that you just don't get notification at the end of the year say, we overspent by 170%, blame inflation, right? We need to have those checks. We need to have those understandings throughout, because that falls on you, right? To set the budget and to monitor the budget. Looking at those resources, that you have, diverse and sustainable resource streams. It's can be a challenge in this current environment to get financial resources in a timely way, right? That we know that the money is coming, but sometimes it's not coming fast enough. I think that's a fair enough statement to say. That we are looking at our board. What kind of people what people do we have? What skill sets do we have? What requirements? Are we reflecting our community? Are we reflecting the where are our blind spots with respect to geographic, linguistic, lived experience, that we're making sure that we have those competencies in that diversity? Do we have, that key employee, that CEO, that executive director? And what are we doing to recruit? I think it was Kathy, just checking my notes, mentioned about succession planning, that we just don't hope that we get the right people, that we're actually being deliberate and going out and getting people. And then also, I think this is maybe an overlooked part of the succession planning process, that we're making sure that they are given the opportunities to learn, and that they just aren't brought onto the board and thrown to the wolves. That we are given opportunities for folks to get governance experience, to understand what are minutes, and it's not just counting to 60 for the board to be meeting to be over. That, what are those sort of fundamentals that we're giving to folks? And that oftentimes that's making sure people have opportunities at the community and the club level, because there may be people who are very valuable voices. We want to make sure that they have the opportunities, and they may be in underserved communities, that they may not have the professional exposure to get that governance work, so that they can serve the national level. So looking sure, and do you have a mentorship program for governance? Do you have relationships so that you can build and have people be able to come up through the ranks, so when they come and they can serve their time on the national board, they are ready to hit the ground running? Those mentorship pieces can go a long way, especially with underrepresented groups at the board level. Who is a director? It's a lot of people on the call tonight. You are responsible for the organization, and it doesn't matter if you're in a for-profit or not-for-profit organization. They are, you are responsible for the members. Sally.
Just a quick question on that mentorship piece. That would be a board member to a board member, or would that be a board member to a possible outsider coming in? Is that an open? Just looking for some clarity around that.
I think it'd be very flexible and open. I think sometimes that we want to make sure we're broadening the pool of candidates, and sometimes it's by providing the opportunities, not for people to just arrive at the national level and say, you're ready to go, but saying, where along the way can we make sure that we are bringing people in to have them engaged in events, right? That's a great opportunity, or committees, that we are bringing people in and giving the exposure to opportunities and the mechanisms of governance, so that they can be successful when they hit the national level. So we just don't bring someone on and say, go, and then be like, I have never sat around a boardroom table. Even as there are, it can be intimidating. I was intimidated the first time as, a new lawyer. I was asked to come and speak to a board because I had never, that was just completely foreign to me. Board of directors was something I saw in like Batman movies and like things like that, not in my real life. So making sure that we're setting people up for in the succession planning, that they're there, that they'd be successful. So they're not just on the board for 12 months and they disappear. So I think it's just a really looking to make sure that we give opportunities to folks downstream. That's really all that mentorship was.
Yeah, I think it's just a good point too. Just like from some PSO lens, that's the lens that I'm bringing. But we kind of get we have our board, and then by the time you have your like good board and your strat plans through, then while you may have altered their terms, there's still going to be a pretty harsh stop where some of those key people are going to be leaving. So when you look at the executive positions, maybe it's starting to bring some new folks around the table into some of those committees, events, et cetera. And then, they might be ready for a more heavy loaded position as opposed to the director at large and so on. So, because I find that's a gap for us as we kind of get into those, the executive tend to stay for, a pretty long, a full duration, I'd say. And by that time, most of the directors have also been in that time frame. So anyway, I'm just noting that I like this idea of having this mentorship opportunity and having it in not as a like board member position, but being very involved in some of those board roles.
Yeah. And I think it can be as flexible as it works for your organization. Yeah, so director, they really, it comes down to they are, and this is, I will clarify this, the member of the board, there is a move away from having directors be members or participants of the organization. So that increasingly we're saying, let's expand the pool of candidates, that you don't have to be in sport to be a good board member, right? That we are expanding that pool, as it were, to include more people. And they are board members responsible for acting on behalf of the organization. They have a couple of key legal duties. I think Peter mentioned about, fiduciary, which is really just that you have a legal obligation to act at all times while wearing your board member hat in the best interest of the organization. That would be sort of the most fundamental, maybe distilled version of what that fiduciary obligation is, that you really must act in the best interest of the organization where you sit. So maybe distill down some of those legal duties. It really is that you have a standard of care, that you are required to be diligent, that you have to read your documents, as tedious and long and boring as they are. And if you don't know, ask. If you don't know how to read a financial statement when you got on a board for the first time, I'm putting my hand up because that was me. Ask the silly question of your accounting friend. What does this mean? What do these deferred, what's it call it, and balance sheets and unaudited statements and audit, what does all of this mean? Don't be afraid to ask. Be curious, right? And don't worry about looking silly, because guaranteed at least half the people probably have a similar question to you. So you really do require that you do act with diligence, and saying, I didn't read it is not going to be a very helpful thing. You have that duty of loyalty, tied to that fiduciary piece, that you must put the interest of the organization ahead of that of another organization and of your own. And this is where that definition of independence from the code really comes in, because there's identified challenge of what hat are you wearing? And that if you owe an obligation to president of a provincial territorial organization as well as the national, when are you serving in what capacity? And it's a really challenging piece. So to make it easier to say, I only have that one hat, and that is on the national board, on the provincial board, and we're not blurring the lines. You have one of obedience that, like our courts have long said that it is a contractual relationship between a director and the organization, and that you must follow your governing documents, your bylaws, and your policies. And you have an obligation to make sure things stay accurate. Again, all of this is within the frame of reasonableness, not perfection. Just to be clear, the law does not require perfection. It does require that you are taking reasonable best efforts to stay on top of things, to stay updated, that your decisions are, again, they don't demand perfection, they demand reasonableness. If you've read your documents and you made a decision based on the information available to you at that time, that's good enough. If you didn't read your documents and made a decision, it turned out to be a bad decision, that will be a challenge. We've touched on the code and we'll touch on it again. Mandatory for NSOs, but I think there are some guiding limits for provincial organizations. Gender representation term limits, fairly self-explanatory. Athlete representation, it was touched on, is a challenge as we navigate, the independence piece. Looking at the competency-based board membership, looking at the matrix that we're identifying where our gaps are, and we're doing some recruiting, the independence and the nomination process. Who here has gone through a nomination process? Anybody? Kathy? Sally? Any comments or observations from the nomination process?
I would say from our side, we were, when we did our call for nominations, we were surprised at the very non-sport folk who did apply. Like we would be within that 90% compliance rate of what you referenced earlier. Our board is made up of very, nobody's really truly related into the sport. It's very governance based, but yeah, we were very surprised at how far our net cast. So that was just an observation we made.
Awesome. I will say there are like the quality of candidates that we can get when you sort of put a little bit of time and the effort into through the nominations committee to reach out is surprising, and there's a lot of people who are willing to volunteer their time, and we're not going to back to the same pool of volunteers, which I think is really important. And we'll go through the nominations in the next couple of pieces. I think we've already touched on this independence. We'll come back to it again. Peter, I didn't know if you had any follow-up questions on what we were discussing before. Really, just to be clear, when we're talking about this independence, it is that you don't owe another organization within your sport a fiduciary obligation. Jess.
Hi, sorry, I just had to unmute myself there. So I'm Jess. I'm from the board of Wheelchair Basketball Canada. I'm actually currently at a symposium of high performance sport in Canada, where there's a bunch of NSOs represented about the culture of high performance sport and how to improve it. And a lot of the talk has been about increasing athlete representation at the board level. And that seems to be directly in conflict with, there were like 2 or 3 slides ago about board independence. So how does that jive with this discussion about board independence?
I not to be the nitpicky lawyer, but I will. The question of what does representation mean? Are they serving in a director capacity, or do they have a standing in the bylaws? Do they have the right to participate in board discussions? Right, like because
I would say from the conversation that happened today, it was be a member of the board, be participating in board level discussions, not so much a athlete council that reports to the board kind of thing. It was very much get athletes involved in the governance.
Yeah, and I think that's I think there's I think that it can't just be at the board level, right? We need to have strong athletes council. We need to have strong athlete working within our committees and our organizations. We do need to recognize that there can be challenges for current athletes serving on the board. The definition of athlete is, I think is it 6 or 8 years? Sorry, I'm just blanking on what it is under the code, because I think the current athlete is where the key conflict of interest arises, not necessarily an athlete who has been recently retired. So it's not to say that there should be a prohibition on current athletes to be on the board. That's not what I'm saying. My view is that it does give rise to concerns about the potential for a conflict of interest, particularly as the board can be tasked with approving things like athlete budgets, allocating resources to which disciplines are going to get funding, developing selection criteria for national or and who's going to be attending which competition. So it's not to say that the athlete voice is absolutely critical and should be represented. It's not just, but I would just say that it's not just simply there is a athlete on the board, we're done. I think there has to be, for have meaningful representation of athletes, we need to look at a more comprehensive approach.
Yeah, and just for everyone else's benefit on the call, like that could be actively managed with a robust like conflict policy and declaration, and having your board members on top of that, right? Like that athlete board member could just declare conflicts for those topics.
Yeah, yeah, and that's, I think, I try to sort of make conflict of interest a celebrated rather than a criticized piece. Like, you are doing yourself and your organization a service by declaring conflict of interest and by identifying and having a robust discussion and not hiding from it. People should be celebrated for coming forward with conflicts, not booed. I hope no one's booing at any point in a board meeting, but particularly on conflict of interest, don't boo. Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate your comments. So looking at the time, I just will make this piece on the conflict of interest, is that it's not just financial, and I'll pick this up in our next session, but we need to understand that conflict of interest can be more than just I stand something to gain or lose from a financial perspective. That it can do with promotions, it can do with selection, awards, all these things can be tied up in the conflict of interest. And the SDRCC did put out this very helpful guide and a flow chart, which I'll attach to the presentation goes out for helping to sort of flag and identify conflict of interest in sport. Just in the 30 seconds remaining, I think just a couple of key takeaways in addition to what we've mentioned before is that it is the board, which is the key organization, key entity. It's not the individual directors. It's the board that governs, and it's the board that governs through passing motions. And that's what the voice, that is the voice of the board. And that a board should be determining who is their spokesperson, who is their communicator, right? And that is clearly identified. That we draw the line between governance and management, and that there is a distinction between the two. Similar on that piece about passing motions, that the creation and reviewing and implementation of the policies, or sure, the effective implementation of policies, is very much the primary mechanism of the board to affect change. I'll say it again. I'll say it today. I've said it before, and I'll say it again in the next two sessions. Communication and having those clear lines is essential. So I had some really great questions. I know we are at time. If there are any questions, I'll certainly spend a few minutes on the call now. But there is an opportunity to sort of send them through to myself or to Paul so we can make sure we address them in our next session at a date, which is sometime in April, maybe around the 17th, but I'm definitely guessing at this point. So thank you so much for this first very introductory session. Looking forward to our next two to come. Are there any questions? No? Okay, so I will circulate on my list. I have the slides. I have the SDRCC. Thanks, Aiden. SCRCC conflict of interest flow chart. If there's anything else, resources I can put out. Certainly have more detailed conversations on the nuanced pieces in the next in our next session. Paul, anything to wrap up?
Just to say thank you very much to everyone, and I'll send a very quick feedback survey out to everyone as well, and I'll attach the slides to that. Well, but thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate everyone's input and good discussion.
Perfect. Have a good night, everybody.